Okay, so we're good to go now. Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on climate change litigation, holding corporation and governments accountable. I'm Mohammad 𝗔𝗶𝗶𝗺𝗁𝗲, Secretary Information, Mail Site, Law Students Council, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. Taking upon the topic of today's webinar, climate change. It is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and the effects of climate change are obviously already being felt on a global scale. A significant movement has emerged in recent years to hold government and companies responsible for their part in escalating and climate problems. Climate change litigation is the name of this initiative. We have a specialist on environmental law and climate change with us today, who will provide insight into the fight against climate change that is becoming more and more important. Mr. Ahmed Rafay Alam, sir, a famous environmental lawyer and a campaigner from Pakistan, is our guest today. Mr. Alam is the Vice President of Pakistan Environmental Law Association, and he has over 10 years of experience in environmental advocacy and legal representation. Mr. Alam is also a partner with Saleem, Alam and Company, where he specializes in energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure. He's also been the chairman of Lahore Electric Supply and Waste Management Companies. Mr. Alam has also been a visiting faculty member at the prestigious universities like Lahore Universities of Management Sciences and University of Punjab. His role as a consultant manager in law and property for 𝗔𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗁𝗲 is also worthy mention in this intro, where he has been an instrument in addressing critical and environmental challenges. In addition, he also serves as consultant management for land and property for the 𝗔𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗁𝗲, where he has played an essential role in addressing major environmental challenges. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Before moving on to the words, the questionnaire, do you have any starting remarks?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a very important and pressing conversation we're going to have.
Inshallah, sir. Moving on towards our today's webinar and formally starting it, sir, before moving on towards the specifications of climate litigations and everything else, we talk about those. What are the different types of climate change litigation, and what basically is the climate change litigation?
Well, thank you for asking that, because you can't just explain climate change litigation without taking a step back first and understanding what climate change is and what drives it. So climate change is just that, unexpected and unprecedented changes in very well-established weather patterns. Climate change is caused by greenhouse gases. These gases trap the sun's heat in the atmosphere and raise temperatures, called global warming. Much like when you leave your car shut in the sun during the summer, the inside will be much hotter than the outside. That's what global warming is, and that's what's happening to this planet. Now, greenhouse gases are produced every time we take something out of the soil and burn it for whether it be transport or energy. So if it's coal, if it's oil, if it's gas, if it's wood, when you burn it, it will produce greenhouse gases. And also agriculture produces greenhouse gases. Now, because of these greenhouse gases that have been put into the atmosphere, mostly since the Industrial Revolution, the Earth has heated up on average just 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade. Now, while that sounds like a very small amount of increase on average, and I say on average, there are parts of Earth that are far warmer than 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade, and there are parts of Earth that are cooler. This is on average. What this increase in temperature on average is doing is that it's putting the Earth's natural equilibrium, it's the ecosystem's balance out of balance. And it's this balance of ecosystems that has allowed us as human beings, since the last ice age, several 100,000 years ago, to be able to produce agriculture at a large enough scale to support human civilization. So I'll repeat, these greenhouse gases are causing global warming, which is now threatening the balance and ability of humanity to produce the type of food necessary to form civilization, because weather as we know it is now no longer in control anymore. It's no longer, the averages are gone. And at 1.1, 1.2 degrees of warming, we're beginning to see flooding. There was flooding in Pakistan just the last couple of weeks. There was flooding in Beijing last week. We've seen forest fires in the northern Mediterranean. We've seen forest fires in Canada this year. A couple of years ago, we saw forest fires in the Arctic Circle for the first time in history. we're beginning to see massive pressures on food production that are leading to food shortages. We're seeing increased temperatures in urban areas, heat waves that are coming riskily close to being dangerous to human beings, and these temperatures will continue to rise. So we're seeing like multiple threats on our ability to form and continue as a human civilization as a result of this climate change. Now, once you understand what climate change is, you have to step back and go, then what is climate change litigation? Well, I think broadly speaking, climate change litigation is when you take to the courts or challenge any activity that is either producing greenhouse gases or is driving the climate crisis. So what we see is, there's been one or two cases of public interest litigation in Pakistan that I can think of, and there have been a handful of cases in Europe and Australia, and they differ depending on where this litigation is happening. In the global north, the countries that have produced, and the economies that have produced greenhouse gases historically since the Industrial Revolution, their obligation primarily is to mitigate their greenhouse gas consumption or production, to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. And what we've seen in, for example, the Netherlands in the Urganda case is people challenging the government's commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over time by saying it's not robust enough. So, in the case of the Netherlands, I think they'd promised to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by, X amount of years. And the petitioners in that case said that that was not enough and that it should actually be 50% greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So we see litigation like that. In Pakistan, in the 𝗔𝗶𝗁𝗏 case in 2016, the result of climate change litigation was actually the prioritization of many dozens of adaptation cases. You see, smaller countries that don't have a huge greenhouse gas footprint are under an obligation to prepare or to adapt to climate change. And for countries like Pakistan, a lot of adaptation looks like flood protection schemes, actually, to keep people and their crops safe from flooding. And so what we saw in the 𝗔𝗶𝗁𝗏 case was the prioritization of a number of adaptation cases in the planning and development departments and the planning commission so that they could be approved and fast-tracked and implemented to protect people from the risk and damages of the climate crisis. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Am I audible now, sir? Yeah, sir, जो आपने इंट्रो दे दी क्लाइमेट लिटिगेशन के हवाले से, आई वाज गैस के जितने भी कंसर्न्स होंगे relating to the topic of climate litigation, they are addressed. But moving on, sir, are there any types of climate litigations? Like litigations की भी मुख्तलिफ इक़साम हैं इसमें जो आप कोर्ट्स में जिस तरह केसेस लेके जा रहे होते हैं?
नहीं, देखिए, filing a case because there's environmental degradation taking place, some pollution taking place, isn't necessarily a climate litigation. A climate litigation is when you are specifically taking to court and challenging something that has to do with greenhouse gas production or lack of adaptation. And those are the two broad types and categories of cases that we've seen internationally go to court. There are only a handful of cases that have been litigated successfully. There are a number of cases in court that relate to climate change, and a lot of them, like I said, are basically petitioners seeking to have their governments improve and increase their commitments to greenhouse gas emission reductions in a variety of ways. It could be, for example, like I said, in the Netherlands, challenging their government's decision to reduce greenhouse gases by 20% by saying, no, this has to be 50% reduction. In other cases, it could be a request that governments increase, for example, the rollout of electric vehicles. It could be cases where people say we need a quicker transition to renewables. Or it could be cases where people challenge the expansion of or the production of new energy sources that take fossil fuels, for example. So there could be a number of types of cases. And equally on the adaptation side, you could go to court challenging the government's lack of adaptation projects, the lack of funding for flood protection schemes, the lack of funding for improved agricultural practices, the lack of funding for heat wave protection schemes in urban areas. Those could be also potentially litigated. But just because someone is cutting trees down and you take that to court, doesn't per se make it a climate litigation.
All right, sir. Sir, moving on further into the depth of litigation, climate change litigation, a person who thinks there is a violation of the climate change laws or any or the environmental laws, he takes the case to the court. What are the different challenges that person has to face while the process of litigation?
Well, first of all, there are very few climate change laws. Pakistan has a Climate Change Act from 2017, but it doesn't give any hard rights to citizens. It does set up or envision a climate change council that will formulate policy and a climate change authority that will implement it. And since 2017, the Climate Change Council has only met once, and the climate authority has not been notified. There's a lot to be done, so to speak.
But sir, in the different cases where like there's a standing issue, challenges the people face, the scope of liability, or there is most of the times there are few of the political issues that the plaintiff has to face during the climate change.
Well, I mean, what you get is, I find this in environmental law as well. I've never taken a climate change case to court, right? I'd like to challenge IPP, a coal-fired IPP, for example. I'd like to take that to court. I'd like to say that any coal-fired energy plant or any coal-fired cement plant should be taken offline because the use of coal produces greenhouse gases, and this is dangerous for the climate. And that the very contract on which this IPP rests is illegal, or it can be or seek to have it declared illegal on the grounds that it is a contract that is against public policy. The public policy being, of course, better climate reaction and better climate policies. I mean, we have had instances in Pakistan where energy contracts and mining concession contracts have been cancelled on the grounds of corruption. Now, corruption is undue influence and fraud, which is, again, one of the reasons you can cancel a contract. But you can also cancel a contract on the grounds that it's against public policy. I'd like to be able to do that, but I haven't found the proper facts, as it were. But what I do find taking environmental issues to court, and generally having sensed the upper judiciary's ability to understand these issues, other than a handful of judges throughout Pakistan, a few in the Supreme Court, a few in the Lahore High Court, maybe one or two in the Sindh High Court, there aren't very many judges that understand these issues because they've come from a career path where it's been civil law, criminal law, tax law, and for them to be able to get their heads around these things is tricky. Now, also, as I was mentioning, you have to, when you go to court, it's either you're challenging something that's against the law or against fundamental rights in the case of Pakistan. So you need to have these fundamental rights in place. You need to have those laws in place before you can litigate on them or take them to court. And although in Pakistan we do have a Climate Change Act, it doesn't really give rights to the citizens. It does give obligations to the state to do certain things, but there are no real rights that I can take in a writ petition to the high courts or to the Supreme Court. And so similarly, when it comes to climate change, a lot of the companies that operate in not just Pakistan but around the world, like the big fossil fuel companies, which you could argue are responsible for and profiting from fossil fuels that will cause greenhouse gases and global warming, they are doing so under the cover of law. They're not doing anything illegal per se. They're all following their own legislations, whatever laws of the countries are, whatever standards they are for employee health and safety, environmental regulation, all of those are being followed, which actually then points the question to, or points the issue towards the fact that we don't have hard climate-related legislation that protects human beings' rights.
Very well, sir. Sir, moving on, further discussing the climate litigation. Sir, do you think are there any potential benefits of this type of litigation?
We have to understand that our legal system isn't quite set up for climate litigation. The law, frankly, and the legal sort of infrastructure that we have, especially in the common law countries, is premised on adjudicating property-related disputes between individuals. I mean, that's most civil law. then you've got your criminal cases, right? That's criminal law. There's a statute that you violated, and it's a criminal action. So with the judiciary and judges and the law designed to protect private property rights, it's not really suited, as it were, to react positively or in a robust way to protecting climate rights. What you need in these circumstances, especially where there's no legislation conferring positive rights onto citizens to protect their climate rights, when you don't have that, what you're left with is beseeching judges to interpret the law, to include rights in their judgments. So quite notably, the 𝗔𝗰𝗃𝗧𝗧 case from the Lahore High Court, I think it was decided in the end in 2000, I think it was filed in 2016 and disposed of in 2018, does recognize that the Pakistani constitution protects the fundamental right to climate justice. I'm not too sure what that is, because there haven't been a number of cases since, a number of precedents that have been evolved that can help us lawyers understand what that means. But broadly speaking, what it means is, or what I understand is, that we as Pakistanis are suffering the brunt of a climate crisis, which is largely not of our responsibility or our doing. Pakistan doesn't have a huge history of greenhouse gas emissions. It's only been on the planet for about 75, 80 years. And even right now, it's less than 1% of overall year-on-year greenhouse gas emissions. But the floods last year in Pakistan, there was a study conducted by Imperial College London that found that about 70% of the intensity of the rainfall over Sindh and Balochistan, and we're talking here 400 to 800% of monthly averages that fell over a period of just a few weeks, at 70% of the intensity of that rainfall was in fact due to the 1.1 degrees centigrade global warming that we've experienced. Now, that global warming is the greenhouse gases emitted historically by global north countries and economies since the Industrial Revolution. So the floods last year were not natural, they were very much man-made. And Pakistan and Pakistanis were made to suffer and pay for the greenhouse gas emissions of other nations and other countries done on a historical timescale. So that's what I understand climate justice to be. And within that, if you delve into it, I think you might be able to find tendrils that you can sort of squeeze and peel out, that government spending in Pakistan should be aligned to promote climate justice rather than take away from it. So, for example, with last year's floods, affecting over 30 million Pakistanis, displacing over 10 million Pakistanis, and costing us in terms of infrastructure loss just about $30 billion of loss, that any funding or money that the government of Pakistan gets for climate-related adaptation or sustainability should be spent on those communities and in those areas that are most in need. Rather than, for example, just last week in Punjab, all the assistant commissioners have gone and gotten themselves Prados. If you look at the big spending here in the Islamabad Capital Territory, it's been the Bara-Kahu overpass, or the Malir exchange that's going from Karachi to Bahria town. Now, that's an example of climate injustice, because here we have vulnerable communities that need sustainability and resilience and funding for projects that will protect them against future climate shocks. And what we're getting, rather, is funds being diverted in a haphazard manner to a handful of select preferential elites. And that's also an example of climate injustice. So we here in Pakistan do have one good judgment that says climate justice is part of our constitution. But what we need is more litigation along these lines that can set up a sense of precedent that we can take on and further challenge more cases where government money is not allocated where it should be.
All right. So talking about the government money, how does the climate change litigation, that is the topic of our today's webinar too, how does the climate change litigation hold the corporations and the government accountable?
Well, we here in Pakistan have, because we're a common law jurisdiction, we challenge government for what it isn't doing and what it is doing and violating our rights. So we file writ petitions. But we see in other countries litigation against corporations. Specifically, I can think of the United States, where evidence has now come into the public, which has shown that fossil fuel companies like Shell, companies like BP Oil, companies have known about the consequences of fossil fuel production, but have obfuscated the truth so that they can continue to make immense profits. Now, with this evidence, there are now class action lawsuits for damages that are being filed against these corporations, stating, much like the case of the cases against the tobacco industry in the 1980s, that look, these tobacco giants knew that their cigarettes caused cancer and yet obfuscated the truth and continued to sell them. They had to make payouts subsequently to people who had been affected by their cancer sticks. And so similarly, in other jurisdictions, there are now class action lawsuits for damages that are being filed on account of the new evidence that's been found against these corporations. But we haven't seen that here in Pakistan because, like I said, Pakistan historically and even now is not a large greenhouse gas producer. And what are you going to do? You're going to take Shell to court in Pakistan? You're going to sue Shell? Well, Shell is it's a shell company, as it were. It's a subsidiary. You're not going to be able to get to the parent company that's somewhere else in the world. So I don't know how successful a damages lawsuit would be. And also, what are you going to sue Shell Pakistan for damages for? Their defense is going to be, Bhaijan, we don't produce much greenhouse gases, and in any case, Pakistan's responsibility is not to mitigate; it's to adapt. So that's why we don't see the type of litigation in Pakistan on climate change that you see in larger economies, because that's where the bad guys are present physically, the big fossil fuel companies. And so it's easier to take them to court and to hold them to account than they are in a jurisdiction like Pakistan. Can't hear you.
Yeah. Am I audible now? Okay, sir. The climate change litigation, the climate change process is somewhat most of the people don't talk about much. It's not a much discussed topic in our society now. It is being one now, but not before that. Why did you decide to come into the climate change litigation procedure and all this field of law?
Well, I'm an environment lawyer. Like I said, I haven't really filed a climate change lawsuit or petition so far. And I sort of joke about this, that when I started practicing after a few years, I realized that there were far too many banking lawyers in Pakistan. And so let's become an environment lawyer. No, actually what happened is about 15, 20 years ago, 𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗶𝗺, the now very famous privatization lawyer, and I were having a conversation. I was a very young lawyer at the time. And he advised me two things. He said, you've got to have patience and you've got to focus on something. And he himself had focused on privatization in the early 1990s, and then it caught the wave of privatization that took place in the 1990s, and built a name for himself in a very successful practice. And for my part, I've certainly been patient. My hair has gone white, and it was about 2006 or 7 that I became involved in some activism in Lahore, challenging the government's decision to cut trees down the Lahore Canal to widen it. And we did a lot of advocacy, activism, and eventually went into litigation on the issue. And that's where I was acquainted with Pakistan's environment legislation. And so from there, really, I realized, well, firstly, that there were very few environment lawyers in Pakistan. And I thought, better than being a banking lawyer, one can be an environment lawyer. And I've had a great experience since, because there are very few environment lawyers in Pakistan, and that's given me the ability, and I'm very thankful for it, to have participated at some level or the other in almost all the major environment cases in Pakistan since.
All right, sir. Sir, moving on towards further discussing this global climate change, like you said, you're being involved in these environmental changes and environmental laws since 2005. So what do you think is the ongoing legal situation or the ongoing situations related to these laws worldwide, and later we'll come into the Pakistan area too regarding these laws?
What's the situation regarding these laws? Yeah, the thing is that these laws are outdated. We are now at a state where we are being told that there are enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to lock in a temperature increase of about 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of this decade. 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, and as much as a 2-degree temperature increase by 2050. Now, I have to give you a sense of scale over here. There's no safe amount of climate change, right? Last year's floods displaced 30 million people, and 10 million people lost their homes. The floods in July cost 54, in Pakistan, in Balochistan, cost 54 lives. the cost of climate change is being paid today. And as temperatures increase, these losses are going to multiply. There's one study that suggests that the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of global warming, because you need greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to go from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees of global warming. And most, by the way, greenhouse gases come in the form of air pollution. They come in the form of transport pollution or pollution caused by the energy industry. And as you know, a lot of cities in Asia and Africa they have terrible air pollution. But the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of global warming will be about 150 million deaths associated with poor air quality. Now, 150 million people, just to give you a sense of scale, are 4 times the number of soldiers who were killed in World War I and World War II put together. And so what we're going to see is about 10 million people die a year, mostly because of air pollution, because of climate change and greenhouse and global warming. That's the sense of scale over here. Okay. Now, there are no real domestic laws that seek to control this situation. But there is an international law that seeks to stabilize or sought to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was signed in Rio in 1992 at the big Earth Summit in Rio, the big one on sustainable development, where it was decided that we would try and stabilize greenhouse gases through the course of the 21st century in a way that would prevent any dangerous man-made interference in the planet's very, very balanced ecosystem. And in order to do that, there were a set of principles that were evolved, the principle of common and differentiated responsibility, that because climate change affects everyone, but it affects them differently. It affects different countries and different economies differently. I've already mentioned the fact that big economies that have historically emitted greenhouse gases, are under the responsibility to mitigate those emissions, and countries that are suffering the brunt of the climate catastrophe, countries like Pakistan with a very small greenhouse gas profile, have an obligation then to adapt and prepare for climate change. So that's one of the principles that comes out of the UNFCCC. And the Conference of Parties that signed the UNFCCC, or COP, when it met in the Japanese city of Kyoto in 1996, agreed to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels by having mandatory caps on emissions imposed on different countries. Now, while that seems like a good idea in practice or on paper, there were small island states like the Bahamas, like Vanuatu, like the Maldives, who argued and lobbied that the sea level rise associated with 2 degrees of global warming, because most of the polar and Antarctic ice would have melted, raising sea levels, would actually obliterate small island states off the face of the earth. I mean, the Maldives would be completely submerged by the ocean. So would the Bahamas. So would Vanuatu. So would so many other small island nations. And so they lobbied successfully the Conference of Parties when it met in the French city of Paris in 2016 to insist that global warming be kept to no more than 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, but change the mechanism from an involuntary cap to a voluntary contribution to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So while Paris is seeking to to be more ambitious when it comes to reducing greenhouse gases, it has gone from being a mandatory scheme to being a voluntary scheme. Now, unfortunately, speaking of the law, this planet has produced more greenhouse gases since the UNFCCC was signed than in all of human history before that. I'll repeat that. This planet has produced more greenhouse gases since the signing of the UNFCCC, which sought to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, than it did in all of history before. So the objective of the UNFCCC has failed. The one international law we had that was supposed to protect especially vulnerable countries, especially the larger populations of the world come from developing countries, was supposed to protect us, has manifestly failed. But what do? Where can you sue against the UNFCCC? You can't take the UNFCCC to court. You can't file a writ petition against it. You can't litigate against it.
Well, let's say talking about the climate changes and the destructions caused by the climate changes. So how is this climate science, talking about the litigation and the court procedures, how is this climate science presented before a judge in the court proceedings?
In the Uganda proceedings in the Dutch High Court and Supreme Court, what are called IPCC, Interplanetary Climate Change Reports. These are UN bodies with thousands of scientists who prepare these, not annual, I think these reports are prepared regularly, I think every 5 years, that the evidence of IPCC reports was placed before judges. And so this is scientific evidence that comes without any political bias, as it were. And it was demonstrated by the reports that the United Nations scientists have put together that unless large developed countries increase their commitments to reduce greenhouse gases, global warming will continue. And it was on the basis of such evidence then that Dutch judges then decreed that the Dutch government was not doing enough to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So you'd have to rely on science. You'd have to rely on science that shows, and it's not clear-cut science, I might also add. There are a lot of gray edges over here. There's a lot of questions about which countries are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. You can't just impose a liability on a country without an objective framework of figuring out how much responsible they are for greenhouse gas emissions historically. And we don't have that. So it's not a perfect science. But if I were to take climate litigation to court in this manner, I'd have to have science backed telling me or producing or telling a judge that the people or parties that I'm litigating against are greenhouse gas polluters and are not doing enough to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions.
Sir, talking about now coming on towards Pakistan, specifically talking about Pakistan. So how do you generally take the climate change situation in Pakistan? How do you think it is affecting the environment and the communities in Pakistan, specifically talking about the melting of glaciers or the cutting of trees near the Indus River, the Sindh banks, near Ravi especially? What is your take on that, sir?
Pakistan has a climate policy from 2012 where it lists about a dozen existential threats that Pakistan faces from climate change. And broadly speaking, what we're going to face because of rising temperatures are floods, both in the form of glacier lake outburst floods that we see up in the north when the glaciers melt from the inside and then burst through, causing instantaneous and oftentimes unknown flooding. People aren't prepared for it. We'll see that type of flooding. Plus, we'll see flooding associated with an erratic monsoon or erratic rains. We'll see more intense rains, and we'll see them more erratic than their, the monsoon used to come by the third week of June, and it would last a couple of months, and then it would go. Now, we're seeing erratic rains on a small period of time, huge amounts of rainfall that cause flooding. And in different parts, we're seeing flooding in the northern areas that is not GLOF related. It's just extra flooding, like in 𝗔𝗏𝗏 in last week. There's been massive flooding on account of rains. And we'll see flooding caused by rains in areas that don't normally receive rainfall, like the floods of last year, where rain fell over Sindh and Balochistan in parts of Pakistan outside the Indus Basin that don't normally receive that much rain. So we're going to see floods, and we're going to see increased temperature-related heat waves. Now, both of these have knock-on effects. When you have extra floods like we had in Sindh, it's knocked out the crop, the cotton crop. There's been no cotton in Sindh last year. And there won't be any cotton in Sindh until next year. So that means that they're going to be farmer livelihoods are going to go down. People are going to be pushed towards poverty. The heat waves raise a whole different number of issues. You have urban heat waves, which will threaten lives because human beings aren't designed to withstand temperatures in excess of 45 degrees centigrade for any long period of time, or indeed withstand what are called wet bulb temperatures, which is low temperature but high humidity. And people will literally die because their bodies aren't capable of dealing with this level of heat. And at the same time, these heat waves in urban areas cause people to turn their fans and their air conditioners on, which puts a huge burden on the energy supply because you need more energy to be able to cope with that. Also, in agriculture, and Pakistan's a huge agricultural country, when things start getting warmed up, especially fields, farmers have a tendency to water their plants so that they don't get shriveled up and burnt. Now, last year, you remember the massive floods in July, August, but in the months preceding, March, April, May, there were record-breaking heat waves. I spoke to some people from the irrigation department in Punjab last year around about June, And they were telling me that normally, with normal temperatures, what usually happens is that the ice caps start melting about March, April, and there is enough, well, the heat really starts by end April, early May, but by that time, there's enough snow melt that the rivers are full and the canals have a little bit of water in them, so that when farmers do turn to irrigating their crops because temperatures are high, there is some level of water in the system. But last year, the heat didn't come the end of April or the beginning of May. The heat came the middle of March. Now, the middle of March, people started turning their air conditioners on. They started trying to water their fields. But there was no water that had melted from the ice caps that had filled up the rivers that had come into the canal system. There was no water in Punjab last year for about 10 to 12 days in the system. Now, I'll repeat that. There was no water in Punjab, a land that gets its name from having water. And so, again, you'll have these knock-on consequences are immense. We will suffer crop productivity, there'll be food shortages, there'll be energy shortages, and all of this will put pressure on the very sort of foundations of civilization that we have. So that's what we're going to see. We're going to see these climate events, that they're going to disrupt our economy and economies, our ability to stand back and be resilient against them, and indeed put a huge damper on our future.
So talking about all this destruction caused by the climate change in Pakistan, do you think the government of Pakistan is taking any steps to counter these changes?
Well, look, what's the government of Pakistan supposed to do? Last year's floods blew a $30 billion infrastructure hole out of the Pakistani economy. There were roads and bridges and hospitals and whatnot flooded away. Billions of dollars worth of damage, while Pakistan is negotiating an 𝗖𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗁 loan. Pakistan just does not have the money to be able to stand back on its feet because of last year's flooding. In these situations, what can you expect the government of Pakistan to do? It just does not have the money. So what it does need to do, it needs to look to global climate finance and the international community, not just Pakistan, but countries like Pakistan that have faced immense devastation. If 30% of Pakistan was under flood last year, 80% of Nigeria was in flood last year. The Philippines was hit by 5 hurricanes last year. You know, these economies take a hit. And so countries like Pakistan, or similarly situated like Pakistan, need to have an international financial system that they can reach out to and receive funding so that we can prepare we can get back on our feet and prepare our economies for the climate crisis in the future. And these monies have to come from those economies that have historically produced those greenhouse gases, and I might also add, made money doing so. Money should be placed in by them and made available to countries like Pakistan. Because otherwise, we just don't have the money to do the massive scale adaptations that we need. I mean, just to move Pakistan away from fossil fuels into renewable energies is going to cost, I think it's about $160 billion until 2030. We just don't have the money for that. And if you make a list of all the adaptation projects we need to protect our citizens from the oncoming climate crisis, it's somewhere in the region of $20 billion up till 2030. We just don't have that money, right? We just don't. Our economy does not produce it. And if we did, also note that between 2 years ago and last year, Pakistan's debt profile doubled, because when Pakistan suffered these floods last year, instead of getting aid, Pakistan got loans. So there's something terribly wrong with the international financial system, where big countries and big economies have money to finance wars in Afghanistan and in Ukraine. Or if a church like Notre Dame burns down in Paris, that $1 billion of aid can be recovered within weeks. But when Pakistanis, 30 million of them are displaced because of a monsoon rain, and the United Nations asks for a flood appeal, I think $150 million was just collected. So there's something measurably wrong with the international community, because Pakistan needs these finances to be able to get back on its feet. The money is very much there. You look this up. The Shell Corporation last year posted a $33 billion profit last year. Shell's profits from 1 year could have paid for the damages Pakistan suffered because of a man-made climate catastrophe. Not just that, the largest corporation in the world, actually the richest and the largest greenhouse gas producer, Saudi Aramco, posted a $161 billion profit last year. So there's something wrong with the international community and with our system of economics, that when faced with an uncertain civilizational future, The international community doesn't have money for the people who are most vulnerable. And the people who are responsible for producing fossil fuels and creating greenhouse gases are posting record-breaking profits.
So, further talking about the climate change, the government, even though there are the different type of situations, political, economical situations going on, don't you think the public has brought up any cases other than the one you quoted, that the landmark judgment relating to the climate change? Are there any further lawsuits related to the climate change in Pakistan?
Well, there are a number of judgments where climate change has been discussed. So, for example, in the Ravi Urban Development Authority case that was decided by a single bench of the Lahore High Court in late 2021, I think December 2021, one of the aspects of discussion in the judgment was the ability to acquire, as Ruda sought to do, 100,000 acres of agricultural land on the outskirts of Lahore to build a city using the Land Acquisition Act. And the judge questioned the interpretation given to the Land Acquisition Act by repeated judgments of the High Courts and the Supreme Courts, that once the land acquisition collector and the provincial government are satisfied that land is necessary to be acquired, it will be acquired. He said that this is not enough. There has to be an overarching question, because otherwise you could acquire all of Punjab's agricultural land for residences with one simple land acquisition. And so the judge says this is not right. Justice Shahid Karim, he says there have to be other considerations that the land acquisition collector and the government of Punjab put into this decision. For example, if you're going to acquire so much agricultural land, what impacts does that have on food security? What impacts do that have on the urban heat island effect created by putting so much concrete over natural materials? What are the repercussions on climate change? And so climate change entered into that discussion as an open point almost. We're discussing the limits of the Land Acquisition Act. And Justice Shahid Karim did, in his judgment, say that the Land Acquisition Act should be reviewed when it comes to acquiring agricultural land for residential purposes, because he said more criteria need to be put into that decision whether or not a government can be, or the land acquisition collector is satisfied. Similarly, there was a case here in Islamabad that went up to the Supreme Court. I'm sorry, I forget the name, but I know it's a judgment. It's an order by Justice Mansoor Ali Shah, where the decision by the CDA to convert a residential property for commercial use had been challenged. And the CDA had argued that this is a matter of routine. The property was situated in a commercial area. It was a residential area. It was situated in a commercial area. And that on the payment of fees, there was nothing illegal on converting it. And here again, Judge Saab says, no, you can't just cyclo-style these sorts of decisions. You must put climate considerations into effect as well. Like, if you're allowing for so much commercialization, what sort of preventive measures are you putting in to stop urban flooding? So much of flooding in Islamabad is because residential and commercial areas have clogged up the natural estuaries of Islamabad that take all the storm water away from the city. What impact is happening there? So there are, for example, judgments which discuss climate change in Pakistan, but no specific case that I can think of other than the Asghar Lagari case, which is a climate change case, that takes it front and center.
So, other than the government institutions, there are many of the civil societies working in Pakistan too. Do you think they have played any role in overcoming the climate challenges that are being faced nowadays?
Look, I don't want to downplay the great work that many NGOs have done in providing sustainable solutions to many communities throughout Pakistan. And these sustainable solutions come in the form of accessing water, better farming practices, better awareness on what to do in the event of climate event, like disaster events. It's great work that's been done almost everywhere. But that does not substitute, or it certainly isn't enough. There are 200 million Pakistanis, all of whom are at risk of the climate crisis. We need a government that puts climate concerns front and center of its policies. We don't have that right now. If you look at what our government is doing, look at what the National Assembly has been doing the last couple of weeks. It's been passing legislation on building new universities and seeking to curtail civil liberties by giving intelligence agencies overarching powers for arrest and detention. That's not where the attention of our elected leaders should be. It should be on providing people. Pakistan's at one of the most at-risk countries when it comes to climate change. Their priority should be protecting us from the impacts and the risks of the climate crisis. But instead, our politics doesn't seem to graduate to any further or higher levels than self-preservation.
So, as a citizen, like we talk about the civil societies, we talk about the roles of the government. As a citizen of Pakistan, what do you think people should play the role in tackling the climate changes?
You see, in order to tackle climate change, you have to reduce greenhouse gases. And you want to do that, you have to go to a global north country and get those fossil fuel companies and those economies to reform. Because there's a massive difference between the amount of greenhouse gas Pakistan produces and the amount of greenhouse gas produced in the United States or in the European Union or in Brazil or even in China. Okay, you want to do something about climate change, you have to mitigate against greenhouse gases. But what we need in Pakistan is we need to adapt. We need to be prepared for the flooding and the heat waves. We need to have better, flood controls. We need to have better disaster response. We need to have heat wave management plans in our cities. We need to have water rationing schemes for agriculture. And none of this is happening. And none of this can happen at the individual level. We need to have a shift from fossil fuel energy in Pakistan to renewable energy. An individual can't do that. We need to have better public transport in our cities. An individual can't do that. We need to redesign our cities in order to do that. These things are done by systems and by politics. And so it's not really up to the individual, but it's up to us as collective, as a society, to force politics to these decisions. You see, Pakistan mein dekho, sadkein banti hain because logon ko sadkein chahiye. We have villages now where people have income that they can go and they want to spend money somewhere. They want to send their produce to a marketplace, a central marketplace to earn income. And for them, a street is valuable. Sadak important hai to sadkein banti hain. Pakistan mein hospital bante hain because people want medicine. And we also believe that the government should provide it. Pakistan mein school bante hain because people want that. People need to want to be protected from the risks of climate change before our politicians will respond to it. It's not just a question of educating the politicians. It's also the electorate needs to be aware and demand its rights from the system that they're in. This involves collective social and political action. The climate crisis cannot be solved by individuals. It cannot be solved by recycling your waste. It cannot be solved by replacing a plastic straw with a paper straw. It has to be resolved at a higher level, using the power of society, civil society, and the force of politics.
Right, sir. Last question from my side, then we will go towards the questions asked by the participants of today's webinar. Sir, summarizing all the discussion we had, so what are some of the major advices that you would like to give to the policymakers, to the businesses, organizations, civil societies? What role can they play in tackling these climate challenges more effectively and promote these environmental responsibilities?
Well, my advice would be this, that we know that the climate crisis is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. That's the science. But we've been burning coal and wood and have been doing agriculture since the dawn of mankind. What was the difference since the Industrial Revolution that has brought humanity to this dangerous sort of precipice where all of civilization is at risk? And I will put it to you that they are drivers of the climate crisis. And we must identify these drivers and dismantle them and replace them with something better. Now, in my opinion, the drivers of this climate crisis, for lack of better words, are capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, consumerism, and the fossil fuel economy. We live in a world where business is conducted in a way that we don't mind people getting wealthy. We think great wealth is actually the sign of great success. But capitalism has been nothing more than the unaccountable destruction or the unaccountable consumption of natural resources and the abuse of human labor through history. This unaccountable extraction of natural resources and abuse of human labor has allowed a handful of individuals and corporations to disproportionately enrich themselves and create poverty elsewhere around the world. We need a system that's different. We need a system that's better. Billionaires are policy failures, and we live in a world where we actually think that the Bezoses and the Gates are somehow fantastic, but they're not. We need to have a completely different morality in approaching how we do business around the world. Patriarchy is a system where men are at the center of all decision making, and it creates a systemic discrimination against women in all spheres. We must have women represented in decision making across the board, equally across the board, if we have any hope to have successful mitigation and adaptation strategies. Colonialism has been nothing but a historical exploitation of natural resources and human labor by some countries in other countries. And it has allowed a handful of colonial countries to gain vast amounts of wealth. Where do you think these countries became rich from? You know, the Mughal Empire was one of the richest on the face of the earth when the British trader arrived here in the early 1600s. And 300 years later, the British are the largest economy on earth. That wasn't by accident. It was by a system that allowed for the exploitation of resources and the abuse of human beings and their labor. And we still see forms of that colonialism, neo-colonialism. It's not just countries occupied. We see the forms of neo-colonialism in our economies today. We have to recognize these drivers, and we have to replace them with something better. Consumerism, and here, I think for the first time, it's individual habits that to play, because we have to understand that at the end of the day, it is our desire to consume things that is placing a burden on the natural resources of Earth. You know, the fact that coffee is so widely available in Pakistan. When I was growing up in Pakistan, when I was a teenager in Pakistan, there was no coffee. There was hardly any dry coffee you could get. It had to be, and look at us now. Coffee is grown in other parts of the world. It's flown here. It takes 19,000 liters to produce a kilo of coffee, and then you put it on a plane, and the plane travels tens of thousands of miles burning fossil fuels to bring you something you drink so that you can wake up early in the morning. You want to wake up early in the morning, go to sleep early. That's the consumerism, you see? And it's not just that. Consumerism works on a scale of affluence. An affluent man will consume more resources than a less affluent man. Okay? I consider myself an environmentalist. I have a solar unit at home, but I still drive to places. I still produce greenhouse gases, you know? But still, my greenhouse gases are 10 times, 20 times more than a family in Bhakkar that barely gets 4 hours of electricity a day, baki sari load shedding hoti hai, that don't own a car, that don't consume the way I consume. And you can't put the blame on them. And similarly, you go up the scale of affluence when you're like a Jeff Bezos and have the money to blast yourself into space. Do you know that one space ride consumed more fuel than I will put into my car through the course of my entire lifetime? An SUV burns 4 times more fuel than my Honda City. A first class seat or a business class seat on an airline burns 10 times more fuel than someone sitting in economy. So the habits of the rich have to change, because it's the 10% of the richest people on earth consuming 50% of its resources. That's the consumerism I'm talking about. That needs to stop if we have any hope to do something about the climate crisis.
Sir, thank you very much for providing such a detailed information regarding the climate changes and the drastic effects that this is producing overall worldwide. So moving on towards the questions asked by the participants in the webinar today. Amira Khurshid, sir, as you pointed out that the glaciers melting and the floods due to the climate change of which Pakistan is facing consequences are results of carbonization and unsustainable practices of the North. Then how would climate change litigation help in Pakistan? Should not we focus on trans-border cooperation among developed and developing countries? And owing to the international reputation of Pakistan, how would such trans-border cooperation work?
You're absolutely right. You see, the way the UNFCCC is organized with this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, you can't really do the type of climate litigation, or you can't really have the same view that people in the global north have about climate change. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg, for example, who's campaigned remarkably since 2018. You have Fridays for the Future campaign, is basically calling fossil fuel companies to account and basically calling governments that promote and subsidize fossil fuel companies into account. But we come from a jurisdiction, Pakistan, where we don't have huge greenhouse gas emissions. So you can't really make that argument. You know, at the same time, climate change is felt differently in Pakistan. Climate change is felt in Pakistan in the form of floods and heat waves. It's going to be felt in the form of water shortages. Yet at the same time, look at where our water goes. 90% of the water in Pakistan goes to agriculture. And there are four main cash crops in Pakistan. There's sugar, there's wheat, there's rice, and there is, oh God, what's the last one? Sugar, rice, wheat, and cotton, right? Now we export cotton. We use that water, we make cotton, we export it. We take that water, we make rice, about 2,000 liters of water to produce a kilo of rice, and we export more rice out of Pakistan than we consume. You know, the sugar industry last year, on a byproduct of sugar is molasses, and you can then distill molasses to make ethanol. In 2020, Pakistan exported over $400 million of ethanol out of Pakistan. I mean, that's food-grade alcohol coming out of the Islamic Republic. So we're taking all of our water in a climate crisis, we're converting it into commodities that we're exporting out, making a handful of people rich. Now, we need better analysis so that we can identify the climate bad guys in Pakistan when it comes, because Pakistan climate change is not necessarily about greenhouse gases. Pakistan climate change is about flooding and heat waves and water shortages, and the bad guys look very different then. So maybe we should be challenging the practices of the sugar industry. Maybe we should be challenging the practices of the rice industry, the Rice Exporters Association of Pakistan. Maybe we should be challenging the practices of the ethanol exporters and of the likes. That's the sort of future of climate litigation I do see in Pakistan.
So moving on towards the next question, Maliha asks, will we be taking the cases to the court under public interest litigation primarily?
Unless you can find an individual right that's being affected, and I do think it'll broadly fall under public interest litigation, and rightly so.
Mehak Meher asks, sir, since we are talking about holding corporations and government accountable, what are the laws under which these corporations contributing to climate change can be held accountable? As you said, there is a lack of legislation on this pressing issue, and international law failed to do the job assigned.
Well, you know, great question, Mehak, because look at a company that, you know, look at a company that does polluting or climate unfriendly actions in Pakistan. I mean, it could be I've just mentioned the sugar businesses. What about the real estate sector? You know, the amount of destruction of the natural environment and then bringing in. What about mining, right? In Pakistan, mining, you blow up sides of mountains to produce rocks, produces a huge amount of dust, affects the communities nearby. They all operate under law. They're all companies registered under the Companies Act, or they're partnerships under the Partnership Act. There's nothing there to prevent them from doing what they're doing. You've got legislation like the Environment Protection Act, which sets limits on the amount of water and air pollution. But what if they meet those criteria? You know, we've got mining regulations, but what if these mining operations meet the terms and conditions of their mining licenses? What are you going to do? You know, you can't do anything. This is all kosher, as it were. Legally permissible. So that is a challenge in a jurisdiction like Pakistan. But at the same time, there are opportunities, increasing opportunities, because our judicial system has recognized and protected new types of environment-related rights since 𝗟𝗪𝗪𝗪, the first big environment case in Pakistan in 1994. It's subsequently recognized clean drinking water as a right. It's subsequently recognized something called the doctrine of public trust. It's subsequently recognized climate justice as part of the constitution. So these are all very helpful precedents that can be used to claw your way into challenging what the government is doing or what the government is allowing corporations to do in Pakistan that is harmful to the environment and exacerbating the climate crisis.
Sir, Ghulam Rasool asks, sir, can you explain what kind of hurdles claimants face in the right-based climate change litigation?
This climate change, you're talking about climate change litigation as if it's something common. There are a handful of climate cases around the world, you know, Columbia University Sabin Center has an online database of climate-related judgments. अब उसमें, I mean, अजीब-अजीब चीजें आ जाती हैं. There was a judgment by Justice Jawad Hassan in the Lahore High Court, 2019 या 20 की है, regarding forest policy, specifically urban forests, and the need to grow more trees in urban areas. तो उसको भी उसके अंदर रखा हुआ है. And sort of afforestation, as it were, or forestation, is an important sort of mitigator of climate change because it soaks up the carbon that is already in the atmosphere. So Judge Saab's telling the government of Punjab to plant more trees is part of that decision. But it's not necessarily climate litigation. So you're talking about climate litigation as if it's something common. It isn't. It's actually very, very new. It's a fresh field. And it's something that all of us should, if you're interested, look into, because what it means and what it has meant for me is that it's something you can make something out of. If it's all, as they say now, green field, nothing, untrammeled snow, then it's up to you to make of it what you can.
So, Farishna Tawfiq asks, sir, we as a citizen of Pakistan are deprived of getting our basic necessities. We can't even get a job after getting degrees. Do you think that we are in a position to ask the government for the climate change, or can we expect any positive response from them?
देखिए, हथियार नहीं डालने. We believe in a system that we elect our representatives and send them to our assemblies so that they can represent us and legislate to protect our rights and to enforce them. That's the system that we believe in. If you don't believe in that system, and that is again the system that then separates powers. You've got the legislative branch, you've got the executive branch that enforces these laws, and you've got a judicial branch which interprets how these laws should be implemented or whether or not they've been broken. We must believe in this system. Okay? Now, we need better governance. When, for instance, Pakistan went to the Conference of Parties in 𝗟𝗵𝗁𝗁𝗁 last year in November and made a case for the loss and damage facility. Loss and damage facility is money due to countries that are suffering the brunt of climate change. And it was very successfully negotiated by Pakistan. Pakistan led those negotiations and can claim credit for it. But the week before the 𝗟𝗵𝗁𝗁𝗁 conference, the entire Pakistani political elite, our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, our Climate Minister, the Chief Minister of Sindh, were out in 𝗟𝗏𝗁 inaugurating a coal-fired power plant. Now, burning coal for energy, especially when there's so much sun in 𝗟, and especially since coal creates greenhouse gases, is not the message you want to be sending out. So at the end of the day, I suppose what we need is better representation in our assemblies. We need our elected representatives to respond to our concerns. And here I might point out, our elected representatives must not be distracted from their jobs. They must not be put into jail for frivolous charges. They mustn't be maligned by outside forces in the way they are. They must be allowed to do what they do, or what they need to do, rather than fighting for their existence. So I think interference in our democracy is one of the things we need, so that our democratic system can become more stable and can respond to demands of its electorate and its citizens better than it has been doing right now.
All right, sir, now I would like to move towards the closing remark with a question that, as a lawyer who has an interest in this environmental laws and environmental field of the law, what are your opinions and what are your advices for him? And what do you think is the scope of environmental law as a lawyer in Pakistan?
I think a scope for environmental law is, because we have these environment tribunals under the Environment Protection Act. If you're talking about litigation, you wind up before the environment tribunals. And most of those cases over there are the EPA taking complaints against contraventions of the Environment Protection Act. They're taking polluters to court. So your job there will be to defend these people, defend corporations, defend individuals for contraventions of the Environment Protection Act. I think better than that is if you have a sense of sustainability and climate change and environment law, you can advise clients to avoid both the risks associated with the climate crisis and also laws relating to environmental protection. A lot of clients that I have weren't aware that Pakistan has environment quality standards, for example, for sound. There are sound limits for commercial areas, residential areas, and industrial areas, both daytime and nighttime, which if you go beyond, you can take action against. And I've had clients come to me because they're being charged by the EPA for noise pollution, but didn't know that there was legislation. So I think being aware of environment laws will better help you advise clients to put together initiatives and projects that are much more environmentally friendly and climate resilient. And that scope will be appreciated. Also a lot of climate lawyering is focusing towards the transition a lot of countries and economies are making from their fossil fuel-based energy to renewable energies. So you need to have an understanding of the type of renewable energy resources that are available, and then the financing mechanisms and the various documents that are necessary to see through a renewable energy deal. You need to become an energy lawyer, as it were. And if you're an energy lawyer that specializes in renewables, you're doing climate change's work. Similarly, you can work with large infrastructure companies, companies that are producing hydropower, which is arguably a renewable energy resource, so that they can put their projects together without displacing people in the manner that so many hydropower projects have been guilty of in the past. You can bring a better sense of awareness of the environment for your clients so that they don't make the mistakes that previous initiatives had and have harmed the environment and exacerbated the climate crisis.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. I hope the information provided during this in this webinar helped to clarify the difficulties that climate change litigation faces, as well as its potential to affect the good change. Thank you, sir. Any closing remarks before we close it?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm getting older, and I do recognize that I recognize more clearly now than when I started doing environment law that the planet belongs to people like yourself, people listening to this webinar. It's yours. I'm leaving it in a bad state for you. Now, what that means is that we're taught, especially in Pakistan and our culture, to give a certain amount of respect to our elders. And this is true, one should. But this should not blind you to the mistakes that they make. And if you see that they're making mistakes that are harming the environment and are causing or exacerbating the climate crisis, it is your responsibility to call them out. To call them out and to challenge them and to make the world a better place.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, once again for sharing your knowledge and insightful observation on this topic. Thank you for the participants, to all the participants joining us in today's webinar. Law Students Council will be back with another webinar, inshallah, soon. Till then, take care and Allah Hafiz.